Yesterday on the show, we talked about the long overdue and yet still considering what has happened so far, shocking arrest of Ed Buck following a third overdose. And joining us now, I believe, potentially with some breaking news, Ashley Marie Preston. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How's it going, you have a connection to this story. It's something that you've been working on for some time, and it seems like things are developing pretty fast, right?
They are, and to our advantage. So from what I understand, per Jasmine Mechanic, who has been one of the investigatory journalists and political consultants who's helped steer this case, she said that this morning he was arraigned. He was supposed to be arraigned yesterday, but they pushed it back till today. And they are taking the case out of the hands of DA Jackie Lacey, and the feds are stepping in, and he is going to be charged for the deaths of Jamel Moore and Timothy Dean.
Well, that is certainly big news, and I know that there's been frustration with Jackie Lacey. Previously, prior to this breaking news, the idea had been that based on the drug charges, there was the possibility of something like 5 or 6 years, which might have meant little or no actual time in prison.
Exactly.
So it seems like now there's a better chance that a more significant period of time might actually be warranted.
Most certainly. That was actually my initial prediction, was that if they're saying 5 years, 8 months is the max, they're probably going to give him maybe a year or less, and then he can get sentenced to a drug program or like that kind of thing. But the reality is that this was an opportunity to frame the conversation around human trafficking, because when you look at the case and the details, it's the textbook example. He specifically targeted Black gay men, and they weren't just any Black gay men. They were Black gay men who had experience around substance abuse, homelessness, those who maybe face socioeconomic poverty, all of these things that make them exponentially vulnerable to a predator such as Ed Buck.
Do you think that if he had been targeting young gay white men, or if he'd been targeting white women, do you believe that this would have long ago been a much bigger national story?
Oh, of course. In fact, when we looked at Jamel Moore's journal and did some digging, he had went to the police station. He went to the sheriff's department and he was turned away. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, there's just so many different pieces to it. But I think going back to the human trafficking part, because the thing is that when they entered his home, they found hundreds of photos of various men who were in compromising positions, which many would know that those are used for coercion and to keep their victims cooperative. He would often forcibly inject them with lethal doses of methamphetamine. And also he would use financial power to control them. And so there's a study that was done from 2012 to September of 2016 that revealed that there were 24,000 cases of human trafficking in the United States. Of those 24,000, 3,000, which accounted for 13%, were men. And they were typically men who had past experience with childhood sexual abuse or physical abuse. They grew up in a home with someone who struggled with substance abuse. These are often men who suffer with mental health challenges. These are men who have all of these wide array of vulnerabilities. And so at the end of the day, he was drugging these men. He was targeting them. He was finding men who had experiences with racism and legacy colonialism, and he was exploiting that to his advantage. And so when you look at the actual textbook definition of human trafficking, that's exactly what it is. It is the exploitation for sexual labor, manual labor, or commercial sexual exploitation.
So I don't want to get ahead of where we're at legally, but we've moved from possible drug charges to charges for the actual deaths. What is the feeling that you're getting in terms of confidence that he hasn't simply moved the point where he avoids justice a little bit further down the line, that there will actually be a just outcome? What are people thinking at this point?
I know that people are not going to let this go. It has reached mainstream media. I was actually one of 3 outlets. This is back when I was editor in chief at Wear Your Voice, and it was the WeHo Times, Wear Your Voice, and Jasmine Cannick's independent blog who were willing to break the story. So now you see all of these mainstream outlets talking about it. And so now there's a consciousness around what's happening. And so like if you go on Twitter, Facebook, and all of these social media platforms, people are actually talking about this. They're also talking about what does this mean around Black lives in general? Because there's this common idea that Black bodies are disposable. We see this conversation taking place when it comes to police brutality and African-American cis men and women, but also looking at the LGBTQ community and giving the Black community at large an opportunity to show up for us.
Yeah. So you might have actually started to get into this area, but I'm curious now that this has expanded to a topic where it's getting national coverage, and as the court case continues, that's likely to continue as well. Are there any aspects of this story that you fear that the mainstream media or anyone covering it might get wrong?
I don't know if it's necessarily. I think the first part is, we often hear people say like, oh, what was he doing on the streets? You know, like, where was his mother? Where were his parents? And so again, going back to the idea around trafficking and psychological manipulation, he had a loving family. Letitia Nixon, his mother, showered him with love. In fact, when Jamel Moore, we're talking about Jamel Moore specifically, died, he was in Texas. Ed Buck flew him out to California and he was dead within 4 hours of arriving back to California. Wow. So I think that mainstream media should stop demonizing family and loved ones of these victims, because it's a lot more complex and nuanced than that. And I think the other piece is media has a tendency to basically politicize the death and to use it as an opportunity to take shots at the Democratic Party. And the reality is predators or predatorial tendencies aren't necessarily a partisan quality or attribute. It can happen to anyone. Yeah. And so the thing that has annoyed many of us is reading these headlines, and in the headlines, they're running his resume. Ed Buck, Democratic donor, activist, animal activist, philanthropist, Whole Foods expert, all of this crap that has nothing to do with the fact that Ed Buck is a sexual predator and human trafficker who exploited gay Black men and forcibly injected them with lethal doses of methamphetamine. Wow. Period. That's it. Well, and so I think it's the media's way of trying to shield wealthy white men and their virtue. And so that's a very dangerous thing. Yeah, Ashley, I actually hadn't known that he was an animal activist. I mean, it kind of changes everything, doesn't it? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, very good. And hopefully people who should know better will pay attention to what you said there. I have one more question, just because I hadn't actually previously known this, but you actually met Ed Buck back when you were a board member at the Stonewall Democratic Club. What was that interaction like? Was there any sort of indication of who this person actually was? Absolutely. So basically, I had just come on to the board and we were at a retreat up in the mountains. And so this is early 2016, like around the holidays. And I had walked out onto the patio to get some fresh air. It was like snow outside, which I hadn't seen snow in a long time since I left Kentucky. And he came out to join me on the patio area. And so we were just casually talking, taking pictures, all that. We took selfies. Then he goes through his phone and he's looking at this video and he's like really fixated on his phone. And he's like, God, he's so hot. He's so hot. He's so sexy. And I'm like, who? And so he turns the phone to me and it's a video of a Black young man between the ages of maybe like 21 and 26. He's sitting in a chair in a dark room, and the only light that fills the room is the flicker of the lighter under the bowl of meth that he's smoking. And so you could clearly see that the individual was addicted, and they were out of their minds. And he got some kind of satisfaction from watching the brokenness of this person in one of their most vulnerable moments. And so in that moment, I didn't, in my mind, I'm thinking two consenting adults. At this time, I didn't have a lot of language around human trafficking and what all of that meant and exploitation. But I knew that there was a definite power dynamic there that was disproportionate. And so fast forwarding, when I heard about the death of Jamel Moore, it was in that moment that I knew that this was a predator and this was someone who got off on the consumption of someone's dignity.
Yeah. Wow, that is unbelievable. Ashley Marie Preston, civil rights activist and journalist, thank you as always for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.